Hey everybody, my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and this video was my thoughts on the American Healthcare Act. Now, bottom line is the American Healthcare Act doesn't take any kind of bold steps in changing the direction of the healthcare debate. It keeps the debate around expand healthcare coverage or maintain healthcare coverage insurance-wise to as many people as possible. It doesn't challenge the idea of whether third-party payment is the best way to achieve healthcare, the delivery of healthcare services. It doesn't address anything driving the cost of healthcare services. It doesn't basically address any of the fundamental issues, kind of like the Affordable Care Act did. All it did was focus on how can we expand insurance coverage to as many people as possible, without any questioning of the fundamental reasons why there isn't more coverage naturally. So essentially what's going on here with the American Healthcare Act is that they're just operating within the parameters that the Affordable Care Act set, which is basically the idea is provide coverage by forcing people to get coverage, not allowing insurance companies to turn anyone away, and subsidizing those who can't afford it otherwise. The only difference is that the American Healthcare Act takes a different bit of approach. Instead of a mandate where you have to pay a penalty come tax time if you don't have coverage, the American Healthcare Act says, hey, if you don't have coverage for a prolonged period of time, when you do get coverage later on, the insurance company can charge you a lot of money for a year. So it becomes a much more harsh penalty, but it's from the insurance company, not from, it's not a tax. The Affordable Care Act provides subsidies to those who may not be able to afford health insurance on a need basis, while the American Healthcare Act provides subsidies on a not need basis, but on an age basis. As you get older, the subsidy grows from $2,000 to $4,000 as you get older as a tax credit. But the problem with that is, or the criticism of that is that technically people's healthcare expenses are growing much faster than the subsidy grows. So you're actually getting a reduction as a portion of your healthcare costs as you get older. So it becomes less generous as you get older. So basically, the American Healthcare Act version basically creates stronger incentives for younger, healthier people to get coverage, which the reason why that may be the case is the idea is if more healthy people have coverage, it makes it easier to cover non-healthy people. Instead of where in the Affordable Care Act, all the subsidies, all the incentives were to help people who are sick to get covered. But there was very little incentive other than the tax penalty, which a lot of people just paid, to get healthy people enrolled, which created an imbalance of healthy to unhealthy people in insurance company risk pools. So the American Health Care Act tries to kind of change the incentives there. How much will those incentives really change place? And as far as how will that affect people who depended much more heavily on those subsidies, lower income folk, older folk, how it's going to affect their ability to pay for their health care. We'll find out, because again, there may be price changes in the way healthcare is priced and whatnot, some other dynamic changes that occur when the incentives are changed that are just not measurable through static modeling like what the CBO does. So it's kind of, anyone's guess is as good as mine. And then the only other big difference with sort of the continuous coverage thing and the subsidies is that under the Affordable Care Act, the subsidies were only applicable if you bought healthcare through the individual healthcare exchanges. While in the Republican plan, the American Healthcare Act, you get the subsidies no matter what. Now, the most controversial part of the American Healthcare Act is the state waiver. Now, what this does, basically people are trying to build this as, oh, it's allowing states to not cover pre-existing conditions. It's not quite that. Basically, the pre-existing condition mandate still in effect. Insurance companies cannot turn people away for having pre-existing conditions. But a state, if the state legislature chooses to, can pass legislation to allow them to apply for a waiver. They apply for a waiver and they can get granted the waiver as long as they try to find some alternative way to cover people with pre-existing conditions. Then they're not subject to many of the regulations within existing healthcare law. So then what happens is they will probably the intention is that many of these states will set up what's called a high risk pool. Basically a pool of money to help cover high cost basically insurance or patients paid for by a tax on that state. So Maine does this. So they're using this example from Maine. There are criticisms of the Maine plan in the sense where it's not generating enough revenue to cover the expenses it pays out to cover high cost patients and such and whatnot. So there are criticisms, but again, doesn't mean each state who decides to apply for this waiver is going to do it identical to Maine. But from a conservative point of view, it at least gives states some flexibility to find a better way of doing things. But it still kind of makes some effort to make sure people with pre-existing conditions are covered. Now, as a libertarian, again, this is just totally not addressing the concerns at all. Concerns over intellectual property and how that affects the cost, third-party payment and how that affects the cost. There's all these things that just sort of drive the incentives in the wrong direction, and none of those things are really fixed by either of these plans. All they do is they try to taper over it by making sure everybody gets coverage, so that way the result of these incentives are less bad. But they're not changing these incentives. A really good discussion on this is actually on the Ezra Klein show. He had a guest by the name of Bill Gertie, who was a venture capitalist looking to invest in healthcare startups, and they had a great conversation about incentives within the healthcare system and some of the things that have changed within the healthcare system that have affected pricing. Now, Ezra Klein is openly a very, very left-wing progressive and favors single-payer healthcare. So it's a very interesting discussion between Bill Gertie, who talks a lot about, who's not necessarily a free market ideologue, but definitely someone who seemed to be more market-friendly as far as a market's ability or market forces' ability to have positive effects on quality and price, and ways you can sort of bring those incentives to the healthcare market. They have an interesting discussion in that episode of the podcast. So again, that's the Ezra Klein show, and he's interviewing Bill Gertie. I highly recommend you listen to it. And also, Vox has a show called The Weeds. So again, while all the hosts of the show are very left-wing, they do a good job of breaking down policy stuff, and it's a very good resource just so you can understand how policy breaks down and what are the considerations. And one of the things I like about Vox is that they're not shy about what their perspective is, so you can just kind of listen to it and take, separate the editorial from the fact, and they do a pretty good job of that. So that's what I'm going to say about health care and the American Health Care Act. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more perspective on it. Now, I have a lot of other videos regarding real problems within healthcare and real solutions for healthcare, which you can all find at health.libertarian101.com. That's health.libertarian101. Please go check it out. My name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Have a great day and enjoy.